He never knocked. Men like Silas Vane didn't knock on doors they believed belonged to them by right of wealth and reputation. He shoved open the gate at Silver Creek Ranch that February morning like he owned every frozen plank of it. His two hired men fanned out behind him like shadows paid to intimidate, and he walked straight up to where Ethan Cole was trying to patch ice-cracked fence posts with fingers that had already gone half-numb. "I'm giving you 1 week," Silas said, loud enough that the sound carried across the yard. 1 week to move that woman and her litter off your property. You want to embarrass yourself, Cole. That's your affair, but you're embarrassing this whole valley, and I won't have it." Ethan didn't look up right away. He set down the hammer, slow and deliberate, the kind of slow that had nothing to do with being calm. "She works here," Ethan said. "She lives here," Silas said back. "Unmarried woman, 3 children, sleeping under your roof. You think the county doesn't talk? You think I don't hear what people are saying about this ranch?" Ethan finally looked at him. "Then maybe you ought to stop listening." Silas smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had never once been told no by someone who could actually back it up. 1 week, he said again, turned around and walked back through the gate like he had already won. He probably thought he had. He had no idea what was about to happen to him. If you've ever opened a door you almost kept closed, this story is for you. If you've ever made a decision that felt wrong to the world, but right to your bones, stay with us. Before we go further, we want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to its end. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it truly began. Ethan Cole had been alone for 8 years by the time that broken-down wagon stopped at his gate, and if anyone had asked him whether he was happy, he would have said he was fine, which is what men say when they've decided that happiness is too expensive a thing to keep chasing. He was 46 years old. He had a working ranch, a solid reputation, and a house that was clean because nobody lived in it enough to make it dirty. He had a cat that wasn't technically his. The gray thing had just appeared one winter and refused to leave. And he had hired hands who came and went with the seasons and never asked him personal questions, which suited him perfectly. His wife Sarah had died 8 years ago. The baby had gone with her. The doctor had explained what happened in careful, quiet words that Ethan had not really heard, because there are certain kinds of news that your ears receive but your mind refuses to file anywhere permanent. He had nodded. He had thanked the doctor. He had ridden home to Silver Creek and spent the next 8 years building the ranch into something that looked, from the outside, like a man who had everything under control. He had posted the notice at the Trading Post in November because his cook, Old Patterson, had finally retired to live with his daughter in Helena. And the biscuits Ethan made himself were so bad his hired hands had started eating them in silence, with the particular expression of men choosing suffering over complaint. He needed someone who could handle a kitchen, one person, ideally someone without complicated needs or inconvenient personal situations. He got Marian Hale. The wagon came into view on a Thursday morning, which Ethan would later remember as the most significant Thursday of his life, though at the time it registered mostly as an inconvenience. The wheels were shot. One of them was wobbling in a way that suggested it had been wobbling for some time, and that the person driving the wagon had been hoping very hard that positive thinking would carry them through. It had not. The horse pulling it was exhausted. Ethan could see that from 40 yards away. The animal had the hollowed-out look of a creature that had been asked to do too much for too long with too little rest. He walked out to the gate. The woman who climbed down from the wagon seat was not what he had been expecting, though he wasn't entirely sure what he had been expecting. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark hair pinned up in a way that had started the day neat and had since given up the fight, and she moved like someone who was tired but had stopped allowing the tiredness to show on her face because showing it hadn't helped for a while now. Behind her, a boy of about 14 climbed down and immediately started checking the damaged wheel with the focused expression of someone who had done this before and was already calculating what it would take to fix it. A girl, maybe 10, followed with a ledger tucked under her arm like it was her most important possession, which Ethan would later learn was exactly accurate. And last, from somewhere inside the wagon, a small voice announced, "We stopped." "We stopped," the woman agreed in the tone of someone confirming a fact for the 5th time that day. The 5-year-old who appeared at the back of the wagon had brown eyes and the specific kind of dirt on his face that suggested active effort rather than passive accumulation. He looked at the ranch with the unfiltered assessment that only small children perform honestly and apparently decided it passed inspection because he nodded to himself and jumped down. The woman walked up to the gate. She looked at Ethan directly, which he noticed because a lot of people didn't look at him directly. He had been told, more than once, that he had a face that discouraged casual eye contact. "I'm Marian Hale," she said. "I saw your notice at the trading post in Clearwater, the one about needing a cook." She paused. "I'm a cook." Ethan looked at her. He looked at the boy examining the wheel. He looked at the girl with the ledger. He looked at the small person who was now crouched down to examine something in the dirt near the fence post with the intensity of a scientist making an important discovery. "The notice said one cook," Ethan said. "I know what it said." "It didn't say anything about children." "No," Marian agreed. "It didn't." There was a pause. The wind moved across the yard, and it was the kind of wind that had temperature in it, real Montana February temperature that suggested it was not bluffing. "My husband died of influenza last spring," Marian said. She didn't say it for sympathy. She said it the way you state a fact that explains the situation without being the whole of it. "The bank took the farm in August. We've been working our way west since October. I've cooked professionally, at a boarding house in Lincoln for 2 years, and before that in my own kitchen for 11. I don't burn things. I don't waste supplies. I get up before everyone else, and I go to bed after." She let that settle for a moment. "I'm not asking you to take in my family. I'm asking you for a job." Ethan had already formed the words he intended to say. They were reasonable words. They were the words any sensible man running a working ranch would say. They had to do with his original requirements and the practical limitations of his situation. He didn't say them. At that exact moment, the 5-year-old finished his examination of the fence post, walked directly up to Ethan with the confidence of someone who had decided that social conventions were someone else's concern, and looked up at him with those brown eyes. "Mister," the boy said, "are you the man who lives alone?" Ethan looked down at him. The boy waited with genuine curiosity, not cruelty. He simply wanted to know. And Ethan, who had been about to close the gate politely but firmly on a widow and her 3 children in February in Montana, felt something happen inside his chest that he couldn't have named if he'd tried. "Jamie." Marian's voice was quiet, not embarrassed exactly, just the practiced tone of a mother who has learned to intercept a certain kind of honesty before it lands wrong. "It's all right," Ethan said. He looked at the boy for another moment, then he looked at Marian. "The wage is room and meals," he said. "I can't do better than that right now." "Room and meals is fine. The room is one. You'd have to figure out sleeping arrangements between you." "We've been sleeping in a wagon," Marian said. "We'll manage." He opened the gate. He told himself later that it was a practical decision. The ranch needed a cook. She was a cook. The children were her situation to manage, not his. It was a straightforward arrangement between 2 people who each had something the other needed, and sentiment had nothing to do with it. He had told himself stranger things. Caleb, the 14-year-old, had the wagon wheel assessed inside of 10 minutes. He came to find Ethan in the barn with the specific expression of a boy who has learned to come to adults with information rather than problems, which already distinguished him from most grown men Ethan had hired over the years. "The wheel's cracked through the hub," Caleb said. "It'll need a new one. I can do the work if you have the parts. I've replaced wheels before." Ethan studied him for a moment. "How many times?" "Twice. Once went fine. Once I had to do it twice because I rushed the first time." He said it without apparent shame, just factually. "I won't rush this time." Ethan found he respected that more than he would have respected a claim of perfect competence. He told Caleb where the parts were stored and left him to it. Inside the house, he could already hear Marian moving around his kitchen, and whatever she was doing in there, it sounded purposeful in a way that his kitchen hadn't sounded since Patterson left. There was the scrape of a pot, the sound of water, and then, within an hour, a smell that had not been in that kitchen for years, the particular smell of bread starting to exist. Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen without announcing himself. Marian was at the counter, working the dough with the efficiency of someone whose hands knew exactly what they were doing without requiring her full attention. Nora was at the table, her ledger open, examining something in his own household accounts with an expression of what looked unsettlingly like concern. "You keep your supply costs here," Nora said, without looking up. Ethan looked at her. "That's right. You're paying 11 cents a pound for hay from Dorsey's mill." "I know what I'm paying. Mr. Gallagher's operation on the North Road charges 8 cents. Same quality. My father used to say you should check your suppliers every season because prices shift and loyalty is expensive." She finally looked up. "I'm not trying to be rude, I just noticed." Ethan looked at Marian, who had continued working the dough and was pretending she hadn't heard any of this. "Nora," Marian said mildly. "I know," Nora said, and went back to the ledger, but she didn't close it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father was right about suppliers." Nora nodded, as though this had never been in doubt. He went back outside. He spent the rest of that day doing exactly what he always did, checking cattle, reinforcing the north fence line where the cold had worked on it, making sure the water troughs hadn't frozen through again. The work was familiar in the way that work becomes familiar when you've done it alone long enough that your hands move without consulting your mind. But the house behind him was different. He could see the chimney smoke. He could hear, faintly, across the frozen yard, the sound of Jamie talking to the gray cat with the serious conversational tone the boy apparently deployed indiscriminately toward animals and people alike. He could hear Caleb's hammer on the wheel, steady and unhurried, the second attempt clearly benefiting from the lesson of the first. None of it was what he'd planned. He crouched down to check a fence post and stayed there longer than necessary, and somewhere in the back of his chest was something that felt like the beginning of a complication he wasn't prepared for. And he pushed it down to where he kept all the other things he wasn't prepared for, and stood up and kept working. That first evening, they ate together at the table because there was no other reasonable arrangement, and Ethan found himself at the head of a table with 4 other people for the first time in 8 years. The food Marian put on that table was better than anything the ranch had produced since before Sarah died. A simple roast with root vegetables and the bread she'd started that morning, dense and honest and exactly the right temperature. Nobody made a ceremony of it. That was the thing he noticed. There was no performance of gratitude, no excessive appreciation that would have made the whole thing feel strange. Caleb asked a direct question about the north fence line. Nora wanted to know about the ranch's relationship with Gallagher's mill. Jamie told the gray cat about the food from across the room, in case the cat was interested. "He's not supposed to be in the house," Ethan said, meaning the cat. Everyone looked at him. The cat looked at him. "He was in the house when we arrived," Marian said. "That doesn't mean he's supposed to be." "Does he know that?" The cat sat down and groomed himself with the serene indifference of a creature that has never once concerned itself with what it's supposed to do. Jamie looked at Ethan with those steady brown eyes. "I think he thinks he lives here." "He doesn't live here." "Okay," Jamie said, and turned back to his food with an expression that suggested the matter was simply subject to the cat's own interpretation and not Ethan's. Ethan looked at Marian. Marian looked at her plate. There was a very small movement at the corner of her mouth that he noticed, and immediately decided he hadn't. That night, after the children were settled in the single room he'd cleared out, 3 of them sorted by some internal negotiation he hadn't witnessed and apparently didn't need to, Ethan sat in the main room going over the account books. He found the page Nora had been looking at, found the hay cost entries, found the comparison she'd apparently been doing in her head, because there were light pencil marks in the margin that he recognized as someone calculating the difference over a full season. The number she'd arrived at was not small. He sat there for a moment with that number looking back at him, and then he went to find a pen and wrote Gallagher's Mill, check rates in the margin, underlined once, and closed the book. Outside, the wind had picked up. Montana in February didn't negotiate. It simply arrived with its full force and dared you to survive it, and every person who had built something in this territory had done so, knowing that the land would test you regularly and without apology. Ethan banked the fire and stood by it for a moment, and in the wall that separated his main room from the room where the widow and her children were sleeping, there was the faint sound of Marian's voice, low and steady, finishing something, a sentence, a thought, maybe a story, and then quiet. He stood there longer than he meant to. Then he went to bed and told himself that tomorrow everything would go back to being straightforward and uncomplicated, and almost believed it. The gray cat, who had apparently decided where he lived regardless of anyone's position on the matter, was already asleep at the foot of the bed. Ethan looked at him for a moment. He didn't move him. He told himself that was because it wasn't worth the argument. The morning after they arrived, Ethan woke before dawn the way he always did, dressed in the dark the way he always did, and walked into his kitchen to find that someone was already in it. Marian was at the stove. She had the fire going and a pot of coffee on, and she was cutting something on the board with the focused, economical movements of a person who had been cooking in cold, early mornings for long enough that the work had become a kind of silence rather than an interruption of it. She didn't startle when he appeared in the doorway. She just glanced at him over her shoulder and said, "Coffee's almost ready," and went back to what she was doing. Ethan stood there for a moment, because in 8 years of waking up in this house, nobody had ever beaten him to the kitchen. Not once. He wasn't sure exactly how to feel about it, so he went to the table and sat down and waited for the coffee. And the kitchen was warm in the way kitchens get warm when someone is actually using them rather than just moving through them. "You don't have to start this early," he said. "The hands eat at 6, she said. "That doesn't leave a lot of extra time." "Patterson started at 5:30. "Then I'm starting at 5, she said, and that was the end of that. She set a cup in front of him. He drank it. It was considerably better than anything Patterson had produced, which Ethan noted internally and did not say out loud, because complimenting the coffee on the first morning felt like the beginning of a habit he wasn't ready to commit to. The first week passed in the practical, unsentimental way that first weeks tend to pass when the people involved are too busy surviving to examine what's happening between them. Marian cooked 3 meals a day, managed the kitchen with a quiet authority that the hired hands accepted without discussion, and kept the house in a state of order that had more to do with function than appearance. She didn't decorate. She didn't rearrange things for aesthetic reasons. She found where everything was, assessed whether it was in the right place for the work that needed to happen, and moved what needed moving and left alone what was already sensible. Ethan noticed this about her. He noticed it the way you notice things about a person who is sharing your space, not through any conscious intention to pay attention, but because your eyes go where they go. Caleb started showing up at the barn in the mornings without being asked. The first day, Ethan assumed the boy was curious and would wander off after an hour. He didn't wander off. He watched what Ethan was doing with the fence repair and then asked a specific question about the way Ethan was setting the post, and the question was good enough that Ethan answered it properly instead of dismissing it, and by the end of the morning, Caleb was working the other end of the fence line, and they were doing the job in roughly 2/3 the time it would have taken Ethan alone. "You've done fence work before," Ethan said at some point. "Most farm work," Caleb said. "My father made sure I could do most things before I was 12. He drove a nail with 3 clean strikes and moved to the next post. He said a man who couldn't fix what needed fixing was just waiting for someone else to fix it for him." Ethan didn't say anything to that, but he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Nora's campaign regarding the hay supplier was quiet, persistent, and thoroughly documented. She didn't raise the subject again directly. She was too smart for that, Ethan was beginning to understand. But she left the account ledger open on the kitchen table on the 3rd evening, with a page of calculations that compared the current cost to a theoretical alternate arrangement, and the numbers were laid out so cleanly and without drama that the conclusion was inescapable without anyone having to argue for it. Ethan picked up the ledger, read the page, set it back down. The next morning he sent one of the hired hands to Gallagher's mill to inquire about rates. He didn't tell Nora he'd done it. She found out because she was the one who recorded the new supply arrangement in the accounts 2 days later. And when she looked up from the ledger, her expression was the specific expression of a child who has won an argument without technically having one, and Ethan looked at her and said, "Don't make a thing of it," and she said, "I wasn't going to," and wrote down the number. It was a decent saving. Over a full year it would be significant. Jamie, for his part, had claimed the gray cat with a completeness that left no room for dispute. The cat had been named, though Ethan would later claim he'd never sanctioned a naming, Pepper, on the grounds that his coloring was the color of black pepper on snow, which was actually fairly accurate as descriptions went. Pepper slept on Jamie's bedroll, ate whatever Jamie managed to negotiate from the kitchen, and followed the boy around the yard with the air of a creature who had finally found what he'd been waiting for and wasn't going anywhere. Ethan watched this from across the yard one afternoon and thought, despite himself, that the cat looked better, more settled, less like a thing that was existing on the margins of a place and more like something that lived there. He didn't examine that thought too carefully. The community made its opinion known the way small communities always do. not through one clear statement, but through the accumulation of small signals that you could individually dismiss but collectively couldn't ignore. A man named Grover at the feed store asked Ethan, with the particular casualness of someone who has rehearsed the question, how things were working out up at the ranch with the new arrangement. Two women at the dry goods store in town went quiet when Marian came in to purchase flour and salt, and when she'd gone, they resumed their conversation at a volume Marian could not have missed. Marian didn't mention any of this to Ethan. He knew because he was watching for it, not because he was looking for reasons to intervene, he told himself that, but because he was keeping track of what was happening around his property, which was something a rancher did. The first direct shot came from Silas Vane on a Wednesday morning, 8 days after the Hales had arrived. Silas rode up to the ranch in the middle of the workday, which was a choice designed to communicate that he didn't consider Ethan's time as valuable as his own. He was a big man in his 50s with the particular bearing of someone who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for long enough that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He owned the largest operation in the valley, had more hired men than Ethan had cattle, and had never once done anything to Ethan directly, which somehow made him harder to handle than if he had. Ethan met him at the gate. "Got a minute?" Silas asked, which was not actually a question. "I'm in the middle of something," Ethan said, which was true. "This won't take long." Silas looked at the house. Marian was visible through the kitchen window, moving. "I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think you're a straightforward man." "Then be straightforward." "People are talking," Silas said, "about the situation here. A widow, 3 children, no clear arrangement, living in a single man's house. I'm not saying you've done anything wrong. I'm saying the appearance of it is a problem for the valley, for your reputation, and for—" He paused meaningfully. "Hers." Ethan kept his face still. "And your concern for her reputation is what brought you out here on a Wednesday morning." Silas didn't acknowledge the tone. "My concern is for this community, for the standards we keep. Men in this valley run legitimate operations, and they support each other in doing that, and part of that support is maintaining a certain—" "I needed a cook," Ethan said. "I hired one. That's the whole of it." "She's not just a cook, and you know it. She's living here. In a separate room, with her children. Cole." Silas's voice dropped just slightly, into the register he probably used in business negotiations. "I'm not your enemy. I'm telling you that this situation is going to cost you, socially, commercially. People choose who they do business with, and a man whose judgment they question is a man whose beef they can decide to buy elsewhere." There was a moment of quiet between them that had a lot of things in it. Ethan said, "I appreciate you riding out." He said it in a way that made clear he didn't. "If you'll excuse me, I have fence to check." He turned and walked back toward the barn without looking to see when Silas left. He heard the hoofbeats 10 minutes later, heading back toward the road. He stood in the barn for a moment after, breathing through his nose, one hand on the gate of the nearest stall, and the old horse inside looked at him with the patient eyes of an animal that had seen a lot of human trouble and had opinions about none of it. "I know," Ethan said to no one in particular. He didn't tell Marian about Silas's visit. He told himself that was because there was nothing actionable in it yet, and troubling her with gossip and social politics served no practical purpose. This was at least partially true. The part that wasn't true was the part where he didn't want to see her face when she heard it. What he didn't know was that Marian already knew. She'd heard enough from the women at the dry goods store to understand the shape of the situation, and she'd come home and stood at the kitchen counter for about 5 minutes, just working through the arithmetic of her options, which was something she'd gotten very good at in the last 8 months. She could leave. That was one number. She could stay, and the talk would be what it was, and she would manage it or she wouldn't. That was the other number. She had 3 children and a cracked wagon wheel and $17 in a cloth bag in the bottom of her travel trunk. The arithmetic was not complicated. She stayed. And she didn't let the staying look like fear. The 2 hired men, Roy and a younger man named Decker, adapted to the new arrangement with different speeds. Roy, who was in his 40s and had worked ranches all his life, treated Marian with the uncomplicated respect of a man who had seen female competence in frontier conditions before and found nothing surprising about it. He thanked her for meals and otherwise left her to her work. Decker, who was 19 and had grown up in a household where women were either underfoot or absent, took about a week to sort himself out, during which time he was awkward and occasionally unhelpful in small ways that were more about confusion than intention. What straightened Decker out was not anything Ethan said. It was a moment on the 10th day when the water pump at the back of the house froze solid, and Marian was the one who diagnosed the problem, sent Caleb for the right tools, and had the pump working again inside of 40 minutes, while Decker was still standing in the yard trying to figure out what needed to happen. After that, Decker addressed Marian with the quick, focused attention of someone who has recalibrated. The ranch was changing. It was changing in ways that Ethan could track concretely. The accounts were cleaner, the food was better, the efficiency of the kitchen operation meant that meals appeared reliably without anyone having to negotiate for them. But it was also changing in ways he could only track by noticing things and then deliberately not thinking about what they meant. The house was louder. That was the most obvious thing. Not unpleasantly loud. Loud the way a building gets when it has people in it who are actually living rather than just occupying. Caleb and Ethan talked through problems in the evening. Not long conversations, but real ones. The kind where something useful gets worked out. Nora had begun asking Ethan questions about the ranch operation, not out of idle curiosity, but because she was building a picture of how things connected, and her questions were frequently better than the questions adults asked him. Jamie reported daily on Pepper's activities with the gravity of someone filing important intelligence. And Marian made the kitchen a different kind of place than it had been. Ethan found himself sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings in a way he hadn't done in years, not necessarily talking, sometimes just reading the ranching papers while she finished the day's last tasks, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that you only get with someone whose presence doesn't require constant management. He noticed this. He noticed it and filed it deliberately under practical considerations rather than personal ones and moved on. The first real test came on a Friday in late February that started ordinary and stopped being ordinary around noon. One of the cattle in the north pasture had gotten through a weak section of fence during the night and wandered nearly half a mile into a frozen gully, and it took Ethan, Caleb, and Roy the better part of the morning to locate the animal, get it out, and get it back to the pasture without it hurting itself worse than it already had. By the time they got back to the ranch, it was past 1 in the afternoon. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and all three of them were cold in the specific way that makes your hands unreliable and your temper short. Marian had lunch on the table. Not a gesture, an actual working meal, hot and solid, the kind that reverses the cold rather than just addressing it. Caleb sat down and ate with the efficiency of a boy who had learned to take food seriously when it was available. Roy thanked her and meant it. Ethan sat down and ate and didn't say anything, and Marian didn't ask about the morning, just refilled his coffee when it was empty, and the meal was over in 20 minutes, and the afternoon's work was back on track in 30. Ethan thought about this later, not the meal itself, but the fact of it. The specific fact that someone had known, without being asked, what the situation required, and had provided it. Sarah had been like that. He stopped that thought there, firmly, and went back to the fence line. The problem with the north fence turned out to be worse than the one breach. Ethan spent 3 days repairing the whole section, and Caleb worked beside him all 3 days, asking fewer questions now and doing more, his hands starting to develop the rhythm of the work rather than consciously following its steps. On the 3rd day, they worked mostly in silence, which was its own kind of communication. "You're going to want to check the east section next," Caleb said at the end of the 3rd day, packing up the tools with the care of someone who has been taught that tools left in bad condition are a problem deferred rather than a problem avoided. Ethan looked at him. "Why?" "Same kind of weathering on the posts. My father always said fence problems come in families." Ethan turned and looked at the east fence line in the middle distance. He was going to say something about checking it himself. What he said instead was, "We'll do it Monday." Caleb nodded, just nodded, like it was settled, and picked up the toolbox. Something about that moment, the easy, unceremonious way the boy had said "we," stayed with Ethan through the ride back to the ranch and through dinner and into the evening when he was sitting by the fire with the account books open on his knee and not reading them. He was not a man who allowed himself to want things he couldn't have. He had learned that lesson at an enormous cost 8 years ago and had been applying it ever since with the humorless discipline of a person who has been burned badly enough that they approach fire differently now. He had built his life to a scale that matched what he was willing to risk, which was to say a small one. The ranch, the cattle, the work, the careful insulated days. What was happening in this house right now was outside the scale he had set for himself. He knew that. He knew it clearly, and he closed the account books and went to bed. The next morning, Silas Vane came back. This time he brought 2 of his men, which was a choice that said something, and he came to the front of the house rather than meeting Ethan in the yard, which was another choice that said something. Ethan saw them from the barn and walked across the frozen ground toward the house before they could knock, because he didn't want the knock, didn't want Marian answering a door with Silas Vane on the other side of it. "You didn't listen," Silas said by way of greeting. "I don't remember agreeing to," Ethan said. The 2 hired men stayed back but stayed visible, which was the point. Silas looked older in the morning light, or maybe just tireder. Ethan had known him for years in the way you know the powerful men in a small territory. Aware of them, adjacent to them, never quite allied with them. Silas had always been fair with him in a business sense, meaning he hadn't cheated him directly, which in some contexts passed for friendship. "I'm hearing things I don't like," Silas said, "from people whose opinions matter in this valley, about this ranch, about the judgment of the man running it." "You're going to have to be more specific," Ethan said. "People are saying you've gone soft, that you brought a problem onto your property because you couldn't say no to a woman and 3 children standing in the cold." He paused. "Are they wrong?" It was a direct question, and Ethan recognized it as a trap with 2 sides to it. If he said yes, he was admitting he'd made a sentimental decision and Silas had leverage. If he said no, he was defending the situation in a way that put Marian in the conversation. "I made a business decision," Ethan said. "The ranch needed a cook. I hired one. The personal situation of the employee isn't your concern or anyone else's. The personal situation becomes everyone's concern when it starts affecting the standing of this community. Then I'd say the community has too much time on its hands." Silas studied him. "You're going to regret this, Cole. Not because of anything I'll do, but because you're letting something into your life that doesn't fit there, and when it all falls apart, you'll be picking up the pieces alone, same as you were before." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Ethan stood in the frozen yard and watched him go, and the words sat in him the way uncomfortable truths sit in people, not comfortable, not dismissible. He went inside. Marian was at the kitchen table with Nora, both of them working through what looked like a comparison of winter supply lists, their heads together over the paper with the focused collaboration of 2 people who are genuinely useful to each other. She looked up when Ethan came in. "Was that Silas Vane?" she said. "Yes." She held his eyes for a moment, reading whatever was there. "What did he want?" "To tell me I'd made a mistake." She looked at him steadily. "Did he change your mind?" "No," Ethan said, and walked through to the back room to hang up his coat, and couldn't see the brief expression that crossed her face after he was gone. The week that followed was the kind of week that gets quietly significant in retrospect. Ordinary on its surface, meaningful underneath. Ethan found himself stopping to talk to the children in small moments that weren't necessary, but happened anyway. Nora came to him with a question about which suppliers in the valley were reliable and which had a habit of shorting weight, and he sat down and told her what he knew. And the conversation lasted longer than either of them planned for because her follow-up questions were thorough. Caleb came back from checking the east fence line with a full written assessment that had measurements in it, accurate within inches, and a proposed repair sequence organized by priority. Ethan sat with that list for a long time. He had hired ranch hands over the years, good ones, a few of them, men who worked hard and did what was needed. None of them had ever handed him a written assessment with prioritized repair sequences. He wasn't sure what to do with the feeling that gave him, so he went through the list, agreed with every priority order, and the next morning told Caleb they'd start at the top. Caleb nodded, just nodded. Ethan had spent 8 years making sure this ranch ran without anyone. Now it was running better than it had in years. And the difference was a widow, a teenager, a 10-year-old with a ledger, a 5-year-old with a cat, and approximately $200 savings on hay. He stood in the barn on a Friday evening with that arithmetic laid out clearly in his mind and the wind working at the boards outside, and the house behind him had light in its windows and sound inside it. And he was aware, with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who has spent a long time running away from something that can't run, that something in his chest had quietly, without his permission, started to thaw. He didn't do anything about that. He banked the fire in the barn stove and walked back to the house through the cold. And when he came inside, Marian was setting the table for dinner and Jamie was under it, explaining something at length to Pepper. And the warmth hit him in the face the way warmth does when you've been in the cold long enough to forget what it feels like. And he stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed him. Then Nora looked up from her seat at the end of the table. "East fence repairs start Monday," she said, because Caleb had apparently told her, and because she was keeping track. "That's right," Ethan said. She went back to her reading, satisfied. He took off his coat. He sat down at the table. And somewhere outside, the wind that had been threatening all week began to pick up in earnest, pushing down from the north with a cold that wasn't playing around, carrying in it the first real warning of what was about to arrive. A storm the valley wouldn't forget, the kind that strips everything down to what actually matters and shows you very clearly what you've been protecting and why. Nobody at the table knew that yet. They ate dinner. Caleb asked about the repair schedule. Nora corrected a number in the accounts without looking up. Jamie fell asleep in his chair before dessert, which he would deny later. Marian poured coffee without being asked. And Ethan Cole, who had spent 8 years making sure nothing in his life could hurt him, sat at his own kitchen table surrounded by people he had not planned on, and felt, against every intention, completely at home. The warning had been in the wind for 2 days before the storm actually arrived, and anyone who had spent a winter in Montana knew what that particular kind of cold meant when it started moving down from the north with that low, purposeful pressure behind it. It didn't howl, not yet. It just pushed, steady and inevitable, and the sky went the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon without a single break in it. Ethan had been watching it since Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, he had Roy and Decker doubling the hay stores in the near barn, moving the most vulnerable cattle into the covered pen, and checking every latch and hinge on every door that was going to need to hold against serious wind. He went through the supply situation in his head the way he always did before a bad storm. Not panicking, just accounting. Firewood, food, lamp oil, medicine for animals, medicine for people. Water before the troughs froze solid. He'd done this before. He knew what a Montana blizzard required, and he was a methodical man, and he did not get frightened easily. What was different this time was that when he walked through his mental inventory of the house, the count was different. It wasn't just him and whatever hands were staying over. It was Marian and 3 children, one of whom was 5 years old, and the weight of that arithmetic settled across his shoulders in a way he felt physically as he stood in the barn listening to the wind pick up outside. He went inside at dusk and told Marian what was coming. She was at the counter finishing the prep for the next morning's breakfast, which she did every evening so the morning started clean. She listened to him without interrupting, and when he was done, she asked 2 questions. The first was about the water supply, whether there was a way to keep one of the interior water containers topped up before the outdoor pump froze. The second was about the children's situation if the house temperature dropped significantly in the night. Both were the right questions. He told her what he knew, she adjusted what she was planning accordingly, and they were done in 4 minutes. "How bad?" she asked, just before he turned to go. He thought about the honest answer. "Bad enough that we won't be going anywhere for a few days." She nodded. "Then we'd better be ready." "That's what I'm trying to do." "I know," she said. "I'm trying to help." He left her to the kitchen and went back outside to finish the barn work. And somewhere in the space between those 2 sentences, a small shift happened that neither of them named. The storm hit before dawn on Friday. It didn't arrive gradually. It announced itself at roughly 3 in the morning with a sound Ethan had heard twice before in his life. A kind of atmospheric pressure change followed immediately by wind that went from notable to structural in about 90 seconds. He was out of bed before he was fully awake, dressed in the dark by muscle memory, and out the back door with his rope in hand by the time the first real gust hit the side of the house hard enough to rattle the window glass in its frames. He had rigged a safety rope between his house and the barn the previous afternoon. It was a precaution he'd used before, a simple fixed line you could follow when visibility dropped to nothing and the snow and wind combined to make 20 yards of open ground as dangerous as 20 miles of open country. He clipped onto it and put his head down and went. The barn was louder than the house. The animals were restless. The boards were taking the wind at a pitch that was somewhere between a creak and a groan, and the whole structure shuddered in the heavier gusts like something alive and uncomfortable about it. He checked the cattle first, then the horses, then the latch situation on every door, adding extra bracing where he found weakness. He found two places that needed attention and fixed them in the dark by feel, his hands learning the problem and solving it without requiring his eyes. He was in the barn for roughly 40 minutes. When he clipped back onto the safety rope to return to the house, the storm had gotten worse. This was the thing about Montana blizzards that newcomers underestimated and that veterans never stopped respecting. They didn't peak and hold, they peaked and then peaked again, each time from a direction you hadn't fully accounted for. And the combination of wind and ground drift and actual falling snow created a visual situation that was less like weather and more like the world simply ceasing to have dimensions. Up and down became suggestions. Direction became a memory. You followed the rope because the rope was the only fact available. He was 6 feet from the barn door when the rope went slack in his hand. Not broke. Came loose from the barn side anchor, which he had apparently not checked as carefully as he should have in the dark, which was his mistake, and he knew it was his mistake even as he was registering what had happened. The barn door was behind him. He knew that. He was 6 feet from it, roughly, maybe 8. He turned back into the wind, which was coming from the northwest, which meant the barn was southeast of him, which meant he needed to go left and slightly back from where he was standing. He took 3 steps. He stopped. The problem with 3 steps in a complete whiteout is that 3 steps can take you exactly where you need to be, or they can take you exactly wrong. And in the absence of visual reference, you have no way to know which one has happened until you put your hand out and either touch something solid or touch nothing. He put his hand out. Nothing. He stood completely still in the roaring dark and forced himself to think. He had the free end of the rope in his hand. The house end was still attached. That meant he could go back to the house. He could not get to the barn, but he could get back to the house. He turned, slowly, carefully, orienting himself to the wind direction, which had shifted slightly since he came out, which complicated things. He followed the rope back. He reached the house door and got inside and stood in the back entry with his back against the closed door and the storm hitting the other side of it like something that wanted in, and his hands were shaking. Not from cold entirely, from the specific adrenaline that comes from the honest recognition that you have been closer to a bad ending than is comfortable to acknowledge. He stood there for a moment, alone in the dark, before going further into the house. What he didn't know was that Marian had heard the door. She appeared in the hallway with a lamp because she had been awake since the storm hit, the way mothers of young children are awake when something is loud and wrong outside, and she had been listening for him. She held the lamp up and looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made her ask immediately, "What happened?" "Rope came loose from the barn anchor," he said. "I had to come back without checking everything I needed to check." She looked at him a moment longer. "Are you hurt?" "No." She moved toward him and held out her hand without any preamble. "Give me your hands." He looked at her. "Your hands," she said again, in the direct tone of someone who is not making a request so much as stating an obvious next step. He held out his hands. She took them both in hers, her lamp set on the narrow entry shelf behind her, and she held them the way you hold something that needs warming, not gingerly, but firmly, with her whole grip, and her hands were warm from having been inside, and his were cold enough that the difference was significant. He didn't pull away. He stood there in the dark back hallway while the storm tore at the outside of the house, and Marian held his freezing hands in her warm ones, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the quiet between them had a texture to it that Ethan hadn't felt in 8 years. "You should have checked the anchor before you went," she said finally. Not an accusation, just a fact, stated the way she stated things. "I know," he said. "Don't do that again." "I won't." She held his hands another moment, then released them, picked up the lamp, looked at him in the steady way she had of looking at people. "I'll make coffee," she said. "You're not going back out in this?" "The cattle can survive 90 minutes without you. The anchor needs relashing, and you need to be warm before you go back out. Coffee first." He almost argued. He stopped, looked at the door, thought about those 3 steps into nothing, and said, "All right." They sat in the kitchen at 4 in the morning while the storm committed itself to the task of being a serious storm. And Marian made coffee and cut bread, and neither of them talked about what had happened in the hallway, but neither of them pretended it hadn't happened either, which was its own kind of honesty. At some point, without any particular reason too, Ethan told her about the last bad blizzard he'd been through alone 6 years ago, A storm that lasted 4 days and killed 11 cattle and stranded him in the barn for 19 hours when the house rope froze solid and he'd had to wait it out. He told it the way you tell practical stories, with the specific details that mattered and without the emotional annotation, but somewhere in the middle of telling it, he heard the shape of the story and what it said about what that time had been. A man alone in a barn for 19 hours with 11 dead animals and no one waiting in the house. And he stopped for a moment. Marian didn't fill the pause with anything. She just waited. "It was a long winter after that," he said finally. "I imagine it was," she said. And then, for reasons he couldn't have explained and would not have tried to, reasons that had something to do with the dark and the storm and the rope and the 19 hours in the barn 6 years ago and the warmth in the kitchen and her hands, he laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, a genuine laugh, short and surprised, and it had in it 8 years of quiet and cold mornings, and eating alone, and the absurdity of the gray cat and the ledger, and 11 cents a pound for hay, and a 5-year-old asking him straight out if he was the man who lived alone. Marian looked at him. And then she laughed too, a real one, and it changed her face in a way he hadn't seen before. Not the controlled, competent expression she wore most of the time, but something behind it, younger and less managed, and the kitchen felt warmer than the fire could account for. He stopped laughing first and looked at his coffee cup, and the silence that followed was comfortable in the way that silence only gets when something has been cleared away. "First time I've laughed in a while," he said, mostly to the cup. "I could tell," she said. He looked up at her. She wasn't laughing now either, just looking at him with the steady, direct regard that was simply how she looked at things. "That's not a criticism," she said. "I know it wasn't." The storm raged for 2 more days. By daylight on Friday, the full scope of it was apparent. A blizzard that wasn't playing at being serious, with drifts already at shoulder height against the north side of the barn, and visibility that made the distance between the house and barn feel like a philosophical problem rather than a physical one. Ethan re-anchored the barn rope at first light with Caleb helping him from the house end. Both of them clipped on, moving carefully, and with the specific wordless communication that develops between people doing dangerous work together. Caleb didn't ask what had happened the night before. He'd apparently worked it out from the context, from the loose rope coiled in the entry and the way Ethan checked and double-checked the anchor before committing his weight to it. He just worked. Inside, Marian ran the house with the same quality of focused calm that she brought to every operation, but amplified now by necessity. She had inventory lists running in her head that she cross-checked with Nora, who had taken to the situation with the particular seriousness of a child who understood that this was real and not a game. Nora tracked the firewood. She tracked the food stores. She tracked the lamp oil. She reported to Marian in short, accurate statements and received instructions back in the same currency. And between them, they managed the interior of the house, the way Ethan and Caleb managed the exterior, methodically, without drama, with the right priorities in the right order. Jamie, who was 5 and therefore had a limited role in the operational structure, stayed near the stove with Pepper and narrated events. He reported on what the storm sounded like. He reported on Pepper's emotional state. He reported on the color of the snow visible through the window and offered opinions on it. Nobody told him to stop. His voice in the background of the long storm hours turned out to be something like a reference point. As long as Jamie was talking about the cat, things were still manageable. The cattle situation was the main concern. The covered pen was holding, but the north end of it had a section of roofing that Ethan didn't trust. And on the afternoon of the first full day, he had to go out and reinforce it in wind that made every task take 4 times as long as it should have. He took Caleb with him. They were roped together and to the line, and they worked in short stints with their backs to the worst of the wind, communicating mostly in gestures and the occasional shouted word that mostly got torn away before it arrived. They lost 1 steer, the oldest animal in the herd, which had been losing ground since October, and which had probably been going to go one way or another that winter. But the cold accelerated the timeline, and on the morning of the second storm day, Ethan found it in the far corner of the pen, and that was that. He told Caleb without softening it. Caleb nodded. He'd seen animals die before. "My father lost 4 in a bad season," Caleb said. "He said the ones you lost reminded you to take better care of the ones you still had." Ethan looked at him. "Your father sounds like he was a practical man." "He was," Caleb said, with the particular flatness that appears in teenagers when they've said something about a dead parent, and know they've exposed something they weren't planning to. He went back to work quickly. Ethan let him, but he kept track of the boy for the rest of the afternoon, watching without making it obvious. And what he saw was someone doing work to keep from feeling the weight of what he'd just said, which was something Ethan understood from personal experience. On the evening of the second storm day, when the worst of it had eased enough that the wind had dropped from structural to merely miserable, Silas Vane's men arrived. Not Silas himself. Two of his hired hands, big men, the kind Silas kept for purposes that weren't strictly cattle-related, who came up the road on horseback in the tail end of a blizzard, which was itself a message about how important Silas considered whatever they were doing. Ethan saw them from the barn window and watched them go to the front of the house rather than the barn, which told him they weren't there to see him. He came out of the barn and crossed the yard at a pace that was quicker than his usual pace. He was too late to intercept them before they knocked, but he was close enough to hear the knock, and close enough to hear the door open, and close enough to reach the porch, just as Marian was standing in the open door with the two men in front of her. "Mrs. Hale," the taller one was saying, in a tone that had a studied kind of politeness over something harder underneath it. "We've come on behalf of Mr. Vane. He's concerned about the situation here, and he wanted us to convey his offer directly. He's willing to arrange transport for you and your children to town once the road's clear. He knows a family there who would take you in temporarily while a more permanent arrangement is found." "Does he?" Marian said. "He feels it would be better for everyone, for the children especially. Town has better resources, more suitable arrangements for a family without—" "Without what?" Marian said. Her voice was entirely level, which was somehow more effective than if it had been sharp. The man hesitated. "Without a man?" she said. "We have a home. We have work. We have more stability here than we've had since my husband died. And Mr. Vane's concern for my children, while touching, is approximately 8 months too late to be useful." The second man started to say something. "Wait," Marian said, and held up one finger and went into the house. The two men looked at each other. Ethan had reached the porch by now and was standing to one side, watching. They looked at him. He didn't say anything, just stood there with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing his face did that discouraged further commentary. Marian came back with a folded piece of paper. She held it out to the taller man. "That is the survey record for the northern boundary of this property. Mr. Vane has been suggesting that his eastern pasture extends to the creek line, which would include a portion of Silver Creek Ranch's grazing land. If you look at the record, and I'd encourage you to read it carefully, you'll find that the boundary was surveyed and registered in 1873 and has not changed. The creek is on our side. When Mr. Vane is ready to discuss that matter directly, Mr. Cole is available." The man took the paper. He looked at it. He looked at his colleague. He looked at Ethan. Ethan said, "You've got what you need." There was a pause that had multiple things in it. Then the two men left. Marian stood in the doorway until they were off the porch, then stepped back inside. Ethan followed her in, and she closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment and let out a breath that was the first indication of any internal process behind the exterior she'd maintained throughout. "Where did you find the survey record?" Ethan asked. "In your desk. The third drawer. I was looking for the supply ledger from last spring, and it was in there with the property documents." She paused. "I hope you don't mind that I went through it." "I don't mind," he said. She looked at him. "Did you know Vane was disputing the boundary?" "He hasn't formally disputed it. He's been making noises." "He'll do more than make noises." "I know." She looked at him for another moment. "Then you should probably get an attorney." "Probably," he agreed. He was standing a few feet from her, in his own entry, in the tail end of a blizzard that had kept them both occupied for 2 days, in ways that had stripped away a good deal of the careful, managed distance he'd been keeping between himself and whatever the situation was becoming, and she was looking at him with that direct, assessing look that went past the surface of things to where the actual situation was, and he looked back at her and thought about all the things he was not saying and recognized clearly, maybe for the first time without immediately burying the recognition that he was not saying them because he was afraid of them. "You're not an obligation," he said. She blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. "I need you to know that," he said, "the way I've been handling things. I don't want you to think that I'm keeping you here because I feel responsible, or because sending you away in the winter would look bad. That's not what this is." She was quiet for a moment. What is it then? He couldn't answer that fully. Not yet. He wasn't there yet, and he was self-aware enough to know that, and dishonest enough with himself about certain things, but not about this one. It's something, he said. She held his eyes. Then she nodded, just once, the way she nodded when something had been confirmed rather than resolved. All right, she said, and went back to the kitchen. He stood in the entry for a moment. Then he went to deal with the cattle. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. Not gently, not with any particular ceremony, just with the abrupt quality that Montana weather had of simply stopping what it had been doing and moving on. The sky that came after was the particular hard blue of post-storm winter, a color that looked clean and merciless in equal measure, and the world outside the house was remade into a landscape of silence and white that went in every direction without interruption. The cleanup took all of that day and the next. Drifts had to be cleared from the barn doors. The cattle needed extra feed and water and the kind of attention that animals need after they've been frightened and cold for 2 days. The north fence had 3 new failures in it. One section of the barn roof had a creak in it that suggested the weight of snow had done something to the structure that would need to be addressed before the next weather event. Ethan worked through it systematically, and Caleb worked beside him, and Roy and Decker handled the cattle with the efficiency of men who have done storm cleanup before and know that the fastest way through it is the straight one. On the second clear day, Ethan found Nora at the kitchen table with a complete damage assessment written out in her careful, even hand. Which structures had damage, what grade of severity she estimated for each, what supplies would be needed to address them, and a rough priority order based on what she'd been able to see and what Caleb had reported to her. At the bottom of the page, she'd noted the current supply levels for firewood, food, and lamp oil, and flagged that the oil was going to need restocking within 2 weeks. He picked up the paper, read it, set it down. This is good, he said. Nora looked up from the book she'd moved on to. I know, she said, with the economy of a child who has been told not to be conceited but hasn't fully committed to the instruction. He almost smiled. How did you get the structural information? I asked Roy. He knows more about the barn than you might think. I know exactly how much Roy knows about that barn, Ethan said. I just wouldn't have thought to ask him. Nora considered this. Asking is how you find things out, she said, as though this were self-evident, which to her it apparently was. He took the assessment page with him when he went back outside and used it as his work list for the next 3 days, and it was accurate on every point. What happened with the Harrises came 4 days after the storm broke. The Harris place was 2 miles east of Silver Creek, a smaller operation run by a man named Gerald Harris and his wife Clara, with 2 hired men and no children. Ethan knew them in this way you know your neighbors in ranch country, aware of them, occasionally useful to each other, not close. He heard from Roy, who had ridden out to check the east fence line, that the Harris barn had partially collapsed under the snow weight and that Clara Harris was sick. Roy had seen Gerald in the yard looking like a man standing in the middle of something he didn't know how to start on. Ethan heard this at midday. By mid-afternoon, without having made a formal decision that he was aware of, Marian was in her coat and her boots. You don't have to go, Ethan said. A woman is sick, Marian said. Of course I have to go. You don't know them. That doesn't matter. He didn't argue with that because it was correct. He hitched the wagon and drove her over himself. And when they arrived, Gerald Harris was in the yard trying to do 3 things at once, with the focused desperation of a man who has been awake for 36 hours. And Marian stepped down from the wagon and walked directly to him and said, Tell me where Clara is and what she has. And Gerald Harris told her, and she went inside. Ethan stayed outside with Gerald, and they looked at the collapsed section of barn together. And Gerald's face had in it the particular expression of a man who can handle physical disaster tolerably well, but whose ability to handle everything at once has been reached. I can send Roy and Decker over for 3 days, Ethan said. We'll get the barn shored up. Gerald looked at him. I can't pay you right now. I'm not asking you to. We'll work something out. Gerald nodded slowly, and there was something in the nod that was about more than the barn, more than the 3 days of labor, something about the specific relief of not being alone in a bad situation, and Ethan recognized it because he had felt it himself recently, under different circumstances, and had been surprised by the strength of it. They worked on the barn until dark. Inside, Marian had organized Clara's sick room, gotten Gerald's hired men fed for the first time in 2 days, assessed what medicines were available, and established a clear plan for the next 48 hours of Clara's care that she communicated to Gerald in specific, actionable terms when he came in for the night. Gerald listened to her with the full attention of a man who has been waiting for someone to tell him clearly what to do. And when she was done, he said, "How do I thank you?" And Marian said, "By making sure Clara drinks the broth every 2 hours, and by getting some sleep yourself," which wasn't an answer to the question, but was the right response to the situation. On the ride back to Silver Creek in the cold dark, Ethan drove and Marian sat beside him, and neither of them talked for the first mile or so. The night was clear, and the stars over Montana were doing what Montana stars do, which is to exist with more intensity than stars have any right to, and the road was hard and quiet under the horses' hooves. "Clara's going to be all right," Marian said finally. "You sure?" "Fairly sure. She's got strength. She's been fighting it rather than giving in to it, which is the right instinct even when it's exhausting." She paused. "She needs someone checking on her for the next week. I'll go back." He looked at her sideways. Gerald's men can do the barn work. Someone with actual nursing experience needs to check on Clara. She said it without any self-importance, just the plain statement of a fact about skill sets. "My mother was a midwife. I've done this before." He turned back to the road. "All right." Another half-mile passed in silence. "You offered to send your men," Marian said. "Gerald needed the help." "You didn't ask him to pay." "He doesn't have it right now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You make a point of seeming harder than you are." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's because it's easier." She didn't respond to that immediately. When she did, it was quietly. "I know." They rode the rest of the way home, in a silence that had weight, was pulling in a direction that both of them were aware of, and neither of them had yet decided what to do with. And when they got back to Silver Creek, the house had light in it from Nora's lamp. She was still up, reading, because Nora did not have a clearly defined bedtime, so much as a variable relationship with the concept. And the barn was quiet, and the cat was somewhere inside being a cat, and the whole thing looked, in the dark and the cold, like exactly what it was. A home. Not Ethan's home the way it had been for 8 years, which was a house a single man kept functional and orderly and alone. Something else. Something that had happened to it in the past few weeks, while he had been telling himself it was only a practical arrangement. Unhitched the horse and put the wagon away and stood in the barn for a moment in the dark. And the thing in his chest that had started thawing quietly 2 weeks ago was no longer a small thing, and he knew it, and he stood there with it for a while and let it be what it was. Then he went inside. And Nora looked up from her book and said, "Roy says the north section of fence is worse than your assessment. I updated the list," and held out a revised page of damage notes, and Ethan took it and sat down, and life at Silver Creek Ranch continued exactly as it had, and completely differently than it ever had before. Clara Harris recovered slowly, the way people recover when they've been genuinely sick rather than just uncomfortable, in stages, with setbacks, with days that looked like progress, followed by days that looked like the progress had been imaginary. Marian went back to the Harris place every other day for the first week, sometimes staying through the afternoon, sometimes staying until Gerald could get one of his hired men settled with Clara for the night before she rode back. Ethan didn't comment on the time she spent there. He kept the wagon available and made sure someone could drive her when the roads were uncertain. And when she came back in the evenings with the particular tiredness of someone who has been managing another person's crisis all day, he made sure there was something hot on the table, which was a reversal of the usual order that neither of them discussed. The first time he put food on the table for her, she came in the door and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot on the stove and then at him, and something moved across her face that she controlled quickly. "Roy helped," Ethan said, which was partially true. Roy had told him what temperature the stove needed to be. "It smells good," she said, and sat down and ate without making anything of it. Nora, who missed nothing, looked at Ethan from her end of the table with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and assessment, and when he looked back at her, she returned to her book with the studied innocence of a child who has decided not to say the thing she was thinking. Clara was on her feet again by the second week of March, thin and careful in her movements but functional, and Gerald Harris came to Silver Creek on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and a manner that suggested he'd been working up to this visit for several days. Ethan met him in the yard. "I came to talk about what we owe you," Gerald said. "Roy and Decker put in 6 days on our barn. Marian's been out 8 times. That's significant labor, and I want to settle it properly." "There's nothing to settle right now," Ethan said. "There is," Gerald said. "I'm not a man who takes charity." "It wasn't charity. It was neighboring." Gerald looked at him steadily. He was a quiet man with a weathered face and the hands of someone who had worked his own land for 20 years. And his pride was the real kind. The kind that isn't about appearances, but about a man's sense of his own standing in his own life. Ethan understood that kind of pride because he had it himself. "Let me work for it," Gerald said. "I've got skills you might need. I built my own barn. I know masonry. Your south foundation has a crack in it, I noticed from the road." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "The crack's been there since last spring." "Then it's had a winter on it. Needs to be addressed before the ground moves again." He paused. "Let me do the work. That's how I want to settle it." Ethan thought about it. Not for long. "All right, when Clara's steady." "2 more weeks," Gerald said. "She'll be steady in 2 more weeks." They shook on it and Gerald rode home, and afterward Ethan stood in the yard thinking about what it meant that the storm, which had cost him a steer and 3 days of labor and significant fence damage, had also resulted in the Harris place having a repaired barn and a recovered wife, and his own south foundation getting looked at by a man who knew masonry, and all of it traceable back to the moment Marian had pulled on her coat and said, "Of course I have to go." He was still working through the implications of that when the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday with the weekly mail delivery from Clearwater, a thick envelope addressed to Marian in handwriting that was neat and deliberate in the way of someone who considers presentation important. The return address was Ohio. Ethan handed it to her at dinner without comment and didn't watch her open it, and spent the meal talking to Caleb about the spring cattle assessment they needed to start planning. And when he looked at Marian again midway through the meal, she was eating normally, and the letter was folded beside her plate, and her face was the composed, managed face she used when something needed managing. He didn't ask about it that evening. He asked the next morning because by then it was clear she wasn't going to bring it up. And he had decided, overnight, that not asking was a form of cowardice he wasn't willing to practice. She was in the kitchen, where he always found her in the mornings, and he came in and poured his coffee and sat down and said, "Who's the letter from?" She set down what she was doing. "My husband's brother, Edwin Hale. He lives in Columbus." "What does he want?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how to say something accurately rather than just quickly. "He wants us to come to Ohio. Him and his wife have a house with room. He says," she paused, picked up the letter, read from it directly, "that the situation we're in is unsuitable for children of decent upbringing and that he feels a familial obligation to provide a proper home." Ethan looked at his coffee cup. "Unsuitable." That's the word he used. "What's his objection specifically? The ranch work or the arrangement?" she said. "Living and working in an unmarried man's house. He phrases it carefully, but that's what he means." There was a silence in the kitchen that had multiple things competing in it. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. It was the direct look she used when she wanted to see the actual person rather than the version they were presenting. "What do you think I should do?" That was a question he hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for, and he was aware of that unpreparedness in his face before he got it controlled. He set down the coffee cup. He thought for a moment about what honest answer he could give without stepping into territory he hadn't earned the right to step into yet. "I think you should do what's right for you and your children," he said. "And I think the answer to that question is something only you know." She held his eyes for another moment. Then she nodded, just once, and went back to the counter, and the matter was not raised again that day. But it was present. He felt it in the house the way you feel a change in weather before the weather actually arrives. A pressure shift, a quality of attention in the air, everyone aware that something was in motion, even if they were all behaving normally around it. Nora knew. He could tell from the way she watched Marian that afternoon, and from the way she asked, at dinner, entirely without context, "Is Ohio far?" And then went back to eating when Jamie said he didn't know where Ohio was, and Caleb said it was east of everything interesting. Jamie looked at Ethan. "Have you been to Ohio?" "No," Ethan said. "Do you want to go?" "No," Ethan said. Jamie seemed to find this reasonable and moved on to the question of whether Pepper would need a separate wagon if they ever traveled somewhere, which indicated that Jamie had already worked out some version of the situation and arrived at the conclusion that Pepper's logistics were the relevant variable. Marian didn't look at Ethan during any of this. He noticed that. The attorney's situation with Silas Vane had been quietly building since Marian had handed his men the survey record in the middle of a blizzard. Silas had not come back himself, which Ethan read as a sign that the survey record had landed where Marian intended it to land, in the part of the situation that had legal weight rather than just social weight. Silas was a man who operated through force of personality and economic pressure when he could, but he was also a man who had lawyers and who would use them, and the fact that he'd gone quiet for 2 weeks meant he was having a conversation with one of them. Ethan needed to have a similar conversation first. He heard about Beatrice Wynne from Gerald Harris, of all people, who mentioned her name in passing while they were looking at the South Foundation crack together in mid-March. Gerald had used her 2 years ago in a water rights dispute with a mining operation that had been pulling from the creek upstream and affecting his irrigation. She'd won the case in 8 weeks, which in Ethan's understanding of legal timelines was roughly the equivalent of winning a foot race on a horse. "She's in Billings," Gerald said. "She'll come out if the case warrants it. She charges accordingly." "Is she worth it?" "She won," Gerald said simply. Ethan wrote her a letter the next day. He laid out the situation with the northern boundary, attached a copy of the 1873 survey record, and described Silas Vane's behavior in the neutral, factual terms that he believed attorneys preferred. He sent it with the next mail rider and didn't tell anyone he'd done it. He told Marian a week later when the response came back and it was substantive. She read Beatrice Wynne's letter carefully, which was thorough and organized and written in the direct language of someone who doesn't charge by the word. The attorney confirmed that the survey record was solid, identified a potential weakness in the way Vane's own property had been registered in 1877 that might be relevant, and asked for 3 additional documents by return mail. "She found something in his registration," Marian said, still reading. "That's what it sounds like." "How did she find it that fast?" "She's apparently good at this." Marian looked up. "You should have done this months ago." "Probably." "Why didn't you?" He thought about that honestly. "Because dealing with Silas directly felt more straightforward than dealing with lawyers, and because I was managing other things." She looked at him steadily. "Is that why? Or is it because you've been handling everything alone for so long that you've forgotten you're allowed to ask for help?" The question arrived with the quiet accuracy of something that had been observed over time and was now being stated without cruelty, but without softening either. Ethan sat with it for a moment, which was the honest response to it. "Probably both," he said. She handed him back the letter. "Write to her. Send what she's asking for." He did it that evening. Edwin Hale arrived on a Friday afternoon in the last week of March, which was sooner than anyone had expected and in better clothes than the occasion called for. He was a trim man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that was organized for presenting positions rather than receiving them, and he arrived in a hired buggy from Clearwater with a traveling case that suggested he planned to stay at least several days, which was itself a statement about his confidence in the outcome of his visit. Ethan watched him come up the road from the barn window and went to the house. He reached the front door before Edwin did, and opened it, and stood in the doorway. Edwin took in Ethan with the quick professional assessment of a man who is accustomed to evaluating situations and people rapidly. He offered his hand. "Edwin Hale. I'm Marian's brother-in-law." "I know who you are," Ethan said. He shook the hand. "Ethan Cole." "Yes." Edwin looked at the house behind him. "I'd like to speak with Marian." "She knows you're coming?" "I rode ahead." Ethan stepped aside. They went inside. Marian was in the kitchen, and she'd known the hour was coming because she'd been in a state of careful, controlled readiness since mid-morning that Ethan had recognized without naming. She came into the main room and greeted Edwin with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely bears no hostility toward a person with whom they are about to have a difficult conversation. "Edwin," she said, "you made good time." "The roads are better than I expected," he said. He kissed her cheek. He looked at her the way family looks at someone they haven't seen in months, taking inventory, comparing what's there to what they remember, forming conclusions. Whatever he concluded, he kept it behind his expression. The children appeared, in the way children always appeared when something significant was happening, drawn by some instinct that adults had apparently lost. Caleb came in from the back with the slightly guarded look of a 14-year-old who understood the situation better than the adults might assume. Nora came out of her room with her ledger, which she set on the table beside her as a kind of statement. Jamie appeared from somewhere with Pepper under his arm and looked at Edwin with the clear-eyed assessment of a 5-year-old who hasn't yet learned to disguise what he's thinking. "Who are you?" Jamie said. "I'm your Uncle Edwin." Jamie looked at him. "I don't remember you." "You were very young when we last met." Jamie considered this. "Do you like cats?" Edwin looked at Pepper with the expression of a man who had not expected to be interrogated about cats and was not certain of the right answer. "They're fine animals," he said carefully. Jamie looked at him a moment longer and then lost interest, which was Jamie's characteristic response to adults who were insufficiently committed to their opinions. Edwin stayed for dinner because it would have been strange not to, and the meal was civil in the way meals are civil when everyone at the table is managing something they're not saying out loud. Edwin talked about Ohio, his work, his wife's family, the school situation in Columbus, the fact that there was a church with a good community, the various practical advantages of an established city over a Montana ranch in winter. He aimed most of this at Marian, but he was careful and diplomatic enough to spread it around. Caleb listened without expression. Nora asked Edwin, at one point, what the employment situation was like for women in Columbus, which derailed Edwin briefly before he recovered and said there were good domestic situations available. And Nora said she wasn't interested in domestic situations. She was interested in business accounting, and what were the opportunities in that field. And Edwin blinked and looked at Marian, who offered no assistance, and said he wasn't certain. "I'm certain," Nora said, and went back to eating. After dinner, when the children had gone and Ethan had made a point of staying in the main room by the fire with the account books, present but not intrusive, which was a balance he managed through sheer will, Edwin finally said what he'd come to say. He said it directly, which Ethan could respect even while disagreeing with everything in it. He said that Marian and the children living in an unmarried man's house was damaging to their reputation in a way that would have lasting consequences. He said that the work here, however genuine, was not a substitute for a stable family situation. He said that what had happened to them, Thomas's death, the farm, the months of travel, was a hardship that the family should be addressing together rather than leaving Marian to handle alone in a stranger's kitchen in Montana. He said it with feeling and without malice, and in the tone of a man who genuinely believed every word of it. Marian listened to all of it. Then she said, "Edwin, I need to ask you something honestly." "Of course." "When Thomas died and the bank took the farm and we had nowhere to go, where were you?" Edwin was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know immediately," he said. "The letters took time." "By the time the letters reached you, we had been on the road for 6 weeks," Marian said. Not with anger, with precision. "I'm not saying that to wound you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand what this situation actually is versus what you've decided it looks like from Ohio." He opened his mouth. She continued, "My children are not surviving here. They're becoming something. Caleb has learned more about real work in 6 weeks than he learned in 2 years on a farm where Thomas was too ill to teach him properly. Nora's doing actual accounting for an actual operation, and she's good at it. Jamie has a home and an animal he loves and ground under his feet that he's beginning to think of as his." She paused. "I am not a burden here. I'm not a charity case, and I'm not a problem being managed. I am useful, and I am respected, and those are not small things." Edwin looked at Ethan. Ethan met his eyes without offering anything. "Cole," Edwin said, "I'll ask you man to man. Is this arrangement, as it stands, good for her?" It was a question that contained a trap and a genuine inquiry in equal measure, and Ethan recognized both components and chose to answer only the genuine one. "She's the most capable person on this property," Ethan said, "and that includes me. If you want to know whether she and her children are safe and useful and treated with respect here, the answer is yes to all three. What happens from here is her decision to make." Edwin sat with that. Marian looked at Ethan with something in her face that she didn't fully control, and he saw it and looked back at his account books. Edwin stayed 2 more days. He spent them not arguing but observing, which turned out to be more significant than the argument would have been. He saw Caleb work. He watched Nora go through the accounts with a speed and accuracy that impressed him visibly despite himself. He saw Jamie talk to the cat for 20 minutes about the nature of snow with the solemn engagement of someone conducting important research. He saw how the ranch ran. He saw what Marian had built in it. On the second evening, he sat with Ethan on the porch in the cold, and they talked for about an hour about nothing that was directly about the situation, about cattle prices, about Montana winters, about what the territory would look like in 10 years. Edwin was an intelligent man, and his intelligence was not wasted on the subtext of the conversation, which was two men working out whether they could trust each other regarding the welfare of a woman and three children they both cared about in different ways. On the morning of the third day, Edwin packed his traveling case. He came to find Marian in the kitchen, and they talked for a while with the door half closed, and Ethan didn't try to hear it and went to the barn. When he came back in at midday, Edwin was in the yard with his case, waiting for the hired buggy he'd arranged to collect him. Edwin looked at Ethan across the yard for a moment. Then he walked over. "I'll be honest with you," Edwin said. "This is not what I expected to find." "What did you expect?" "A woman making the best of a bad situation." He paused. "That's not what she's doing." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." Edwin looked at the house. "If this ever becomes something other than a work arrangement," he started. "That's between her and me," Ethan said. "Yes," Edwin said. "I know that now." He offered his hand. "Take care of them." Ethan shook it. "I intend to." The buggy came. Edwin got in. He lifted a hand to Marian, who was standing in the doorway, and she lifted hers back, and the buggy went down the road and turned toward Clearwater and disappeared. Marian stood in the doorway for a moment after it was gone. Ethan came across the yard and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and she looked down at him with an expression that had the particular quality of something that has been held under pressure for several days and is now, carefully, being released. "You told him I was the most capable person on the property," she said. "It's true." "You didn't have to say it in front of him." He asked a direct question. That was the direct answer. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Ethan." He nodded. "I was aware, standing at the base of those steps in the late March cold, of everything that was in those two words, and everything that was in his name," said in her voice, "and of the distance between where they were and where they might be going, and of the fact that the distance was shortening without either of them making any declared effort to shorten it." He went back to work. Beatrice Wynne arrived from Billings 2 weeks into April, and she was nothing like what the territory had apparently expected a female attorney to look like, which was a problem for the territory's expectations and not for Beatrice Wynne. She was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a traveling bag that seemed to contain an entire mobile office and the complete organizational capacity of a small law firm. She sat up at Ethan's kitchen table, reviewed every document he had regarding the property, asked him 40 questions in 90 minutes with the rapid efficiency of someone for whom time was genuinely money, and at the end of it said, "Vane's 1877 registration has a surveyor error in the eastern boundary description. It describes a creek bend that no longer corresponds to any existing geographical feature, which means the original survey couldn't have been accurate." Ethan looked at her. "What does that mean practically?" "It means if he tries to claim your northern boundary on the basis of his registered description, his own registration undercuts the claim. He'd have to petition for a new survey, and any new survey is going to put the boundary where your 1873 record says it is." She tapped the document. "Your record is clean, his is not. Can you make that case in a county proceeding?" "I can make it in a county proceeding in my sleep," she said, without arrogance, just accuracy. "The question is whether Vane knows his registration has a problem. If he doesn't, we present the evidence and it ends quickly. If he does, he'll want to settle before it becomes public." "Why would he want to keep it quiet?" "Because a powerful man with a flaw in his property records is a powerful man who's been either negligent or dishonest. And in a territory where reputation is currency, neither of those is a good position." She closed the document folder. "I'll send him a letter, formal, informational, outlining what we've found. We give him the opportunity to withdraw the boundary challenge before this goes any further." Ethan thought about Silas Vane and his 2 hired men in the frozen yard, and the visit to the house during the blizzard, and the weeks of social pressure, and the conversations designed to make him feel that he'd made a mistake. "Send the letter," he said. She sent it the next day. The response took a week, which Beatrice Wynne said was about right. Long enough that he'd had his own attorney review the situation, short enough that he'd confirmed the problem and wasn't interested in a protracted fight over something he couldn't win. The boundary challenge was formally withdrawn on a Tuesday morning, delivered by one of Silas's men. Not the two who'd come during the blizzard, a different one, younger, who arrived with a sealed letter and left without much conversation. Ethan read the letter, which was brief and careful, and said what it needed to say without unnecessary flourish, and went to find Beatrice, who was still at his kitchen table because she'd agreed to stay until the matter was resolved. He withdrew, Ethan said. Of course he did, she said, and began packing her documents. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Beatrice with the specific expression she reserved for people she had decided were worth paying attention to. Did you go to law school? She asked. Beatrice Wynne looked at her. I did. In St. Louis. Can women do that? I did it, Beatrice said. So yes. Nora looked at her for another moment. Then she went back to her room, and they could hear, faintly, the sound of her writing something down. Beatrice looked at Ethan. How old is she? 10. Beatrice made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. She'll be fine, she said, and closed her bag. Marian was in the yard when Beatrice's wagon pulled out, and she and Beatrice said a few words that Ethan wasn't near enough to hear, and Beatrice said something that made Marian's face do something brief and complicated, and then Beatrice was gone. Ethan came to stand beside Marian. What did she say? He asked. Marian looked at him sideways. She said you were either smarter than you looked or luckier than you deserved. He thought about that. Which did she think? She said probably both. Marian smiled just slightly and started back toward the house. The community's shift was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens without announcement, through a gradual reweighting of opinions that had never been quite as settled as the people holding them had wanted to believe. People who had questioned Ethan's judgment regarding Marian stopped questioning it, partly because the Harris situation had circulated through the valley, and partly because a woman who had walked through a blizzard to nurse a neighbor's sick wife was harder to dismiss than a woman who had simply appeared on a rancher's doorstep. The women at the dry goods store who had gone quiet when Marian arrived started talking to her instead, cautiously at first, and then with the genuine interest of people who had misjudged something and were in the process of revising. Marian handled all of it without triumph and without resentment, which was the right way to handle it. Not because it was strategically smart, but because it was simply who she was. She didn't need people to admit they'd been wrong about her. She just needed them to stop being wrong. And she was patient enough to let that happen on its own schedule. Gerald and Clara Harris came to Sunday dinner in mid-April, the first time Clara had been out socially since the storm, and the meal was loud and good and extended well past the sensible hour. And Clara and Marian talked in the kitchen afterward the way women talk when they've been through something together and come out on the same side of it. Gerald and Ethan sat on the porch in the cold and talked about the spring cattle market and the South Foundation work, and whether the East Fence was going to need more attention before summer. At some point, Gerald said without particular ceremony, "You know what happened here this winter." "A lot happened," Ethan said. "You know what I mean." Ethan looked at the dark yard, the barn with the light in it from the lamp. Roy left burning, the house behind them warm and loud with voices. "I know what you mean," he said. "Are you going to do something about it?" "I'm thinking about it." Gerald nodded slowly. "Don't think too long," he said. "Things that are available aren't always available." Ethan didn't say anything to that, but he sat with it the whole evening, and on the ride to bed he passed through the kitchen where Marian was finishing the last of the cleaning, alone now, the house quieter without the Harrises in it, and he stopped in the doorway. She looked up. He almost said something. He could feel it there, the shape of what he wanted to say, and the distance between the feeling and the words was shorter than it had ever been. But he wasn't there yet, and he knew it, and he had been wrong about his timing before in his life and paid for it. "Good night," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those steady eyes. "Good night, Ethan," she said. He went to bed. Pepper was already there, because Pepper was always already there now, occupying the foot of the bed with the settled authority of an animal that has long since stopped considering alternative arrangements. And Ethan lay in the dark and listened to the house around him, the way it breathed, the way it settled, The different quality of its silence now that it was a silence around people rather than a silence instead of them. Spring was coming. The ground was still frozen, but the cold had a different quality to it now, less permanent, more like the last argument of a season that had already decided to leave. In a few weeks, the pastures would start to green, and the cattle work would expand, and the ranch would enter the season of its most demanding work. But something else was coming too, Ethan knew. Something that had been building since a broken-down wagon stopped at his gate in February, since a 5-year-old asked him a question he couldn't answer the way he'd planned to, since a woman took his freezing hands in hers in a dark hallway and told him not to go back out alone. He lay in the dark, and the cat breathed at his feet, and the house held its people. And Ethan Cole, who had spent 8 years closing himself against things that might hurt him, felt the last of the distance between himself and the life waiting for him. Getting thin enough that one honest conversation might collapse it entirely. He just had to be willing to start that conversation. He was almost there. A spring came to Silver Creek, the way it always came to Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in a series of negotiations between the cold that had been there and the warmth that wanted to be, with setbacks and reconsiderations, and the occasional morning that felt like February had returned to make one final point before conceding the argument entirely. The ground thawed in patches. The pastures greened unevenly. The cattle moved differently when the earth under them stopped being iron and started being soil again. And there was more work in those first weeks of April than in any comparable period of winter, because winter at least had the decency to announce what it wanted from you, while spring had 100 small demands that appeared without warning and required immediate attention. Ethan worked through all of it the way he had always worked: early mornings, long hours, the physical logic of a body that knew the ranch's rhythms well enough to operate on instinct rather than decision. The difference was that he was no longer working alone. Caleb was beside him most days now, in a way that had stopped feeling like a temporary arrangement and started feeling like the natural order of things. The way some partnerships become so functionally right that you stop noticing they're a partnership and just notice that things get done and done well. Roy had adjusted his own habits without anyone asking him to, taking the tasks that Caleb was still learning and leaving the ones that Caleb was ready for, a graceful redistribution of work that had happened organically over weeks. Decker had surprised everyone, including possibly himself. The 19-year-old who had spent his first 2 weeks at the ranch in a state of confused adjustment had become, over the course of the winter, someone you could send to handle a problem independently and trust that he'd come back with the problem handled rather than a report on why it was complicated. Marian had something to do with that, though Ethan had never seen her instruct Decker in anything directly. She had simply treated him as though she expected competence from him, and he had gradually produced it. The ranch accounts for the season were the best they'd been in 3 years. Nora had shown Ethan the full comparison in late April, a careful document that laid out the previous 3 years of costs against the current season, with a clarity that required no interpretation. The hay savings were part of it. The reduced waste in the kitchen operation was part of it. The smart management of the winter supply situation, which had meant they'd come through the blizzard without the kind of emergency resupply purchases that drove costs up when the trading post knew you were desperate, was part of it. All of it traceable, in one way or another, to the organized, precise mind of a 10-year-old who had never once asked for credit. "You should get a percentage," Ethan told her, one evening in late April when they were going through the numbers together. Nora looked up from the ledger. "A percentage of what?" "The savings. You identified the hay situation. You tracked the supply costs through the winter. That work has a value." She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "What percentage?" "What do you think is fair?" She thought about it for a moment. 5% of the documented savings, not of the total revenue. That would be too much, and I didn't contribute to all of it. He looked at her. She was 10 years old and she was negotiating with the precision of someone who had read books about it. 5%, he said. Done. She wrote it in the ledger, the entry careful and complete, and then looked up. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he said, for what might have been the 15th time. She looked at him with the expression that meant she was deciding something. "Ethan," she said, and went back to the accounts, and he felt the word land in his chest somewhere quiet and important. It was Caleb who brought things to a head, which was not what Ethan had expected. He had been expecting it to come from within himself, From the accumulating weight of the thing, he'd been almost sane for weeks, and he'd been managing his relationship with that accumulating weight the way he managed most internal situations, by treating it as a problem that would eventually arrive at a natural moment of resolution if he was patient and didn't force it. He had not accounted for a 14-year-old with his father's directness and his own hard-earned understanding of how quickly things you counted on could disappear. They were in the north pasture on a Friday morning in early May, checking the fence line that had been repaired twice over the winter and needed a final assessment before the cattle were rotated through. The day was clear, the first genuinely warm day the season had produced, the kind of day that makes Montana feel like it has been worth all the other days. And Caleb was moving along the fence line with the methodical focus he'd developed over 4 months of learning it. They'd been working for 2 hours before Caleb said anything that wasn't about the fence. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Ethan said, which was his standard response, since it committed him to nothing except listening. Caleb was quiet for another post's worth of inspection before he said it. "Are you going to ask my mother to marry you?" Ethan's hands kept working. He finished the inspection of the post he was on, moved to the next one, crouched down to check the base. He did all of this before he responded, and the response he chose was, "What makes you ask that?" "Because she's going to get another letter from Edwin," Caleb said. He told her before he left that he'd write again in the spring, and this time he's going to ask her to give him an answer. He paused. "She won't go to Ohio. I know her well enough to know that. But if things here stay the same as they are now, she's going to have to leave anyway eventually, because she can't stay in an arrangement that people question forever, and she won't let her children grow up in the middle of a situation that doesn't have a name." Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the fence line without seeing it. Caleb continued, still working, not looking at him. "She's not going to say any of this to you. She thinks you've already done more than she had any right to ask for, and she's too proud to ask for something you haven't offered." He stopped and looked at Ethan directly, with his father's face in his own eyes. "But I'm 14 and I don't have her pride yet, so I'm asking you." There were several possible responses to this. Most of them were adult deflections, the kind that put a young person back in their lane by reminding them that certain conversations belong to the people directly involved and not to their children. Ethan had a version of that response ready, not from dishonesty, but from the habit of a man who has been managing his own private interior for a long time. He didn't use it. "I'm not going to let that happen," Ethan said. "Your mother leaving. That's not the direction this is going." Caleb looked at him. "I need you to trust me on the timing," Ethan said. "Can you do that?" A long moment passed, during which Caleb assessed this answer against whatever standards he was applying. "Yes," he said finally. "Then, don't take too long." "Gerald Harris told me the same thing." "Gerald Harris is smart," Caleb said, and went back to the fence line. They finished the inspection in the efficient silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are now content to let the work fill the rest of the space. And Ethan rode back to the ranch that afternoon with the last of his uncertainty resolved by a conversation he hadn't initiated and couldn't have planned for. Some things need to be given a push from outside. That wasn't weakness. It was just the truth about how people sometimes operate, and there was no use pretending otherwise. He needed 2 days to figure out what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. Not because he was uncertain of what he felt. He'd been past uncertainty about that for a long time, longer than he'd been admitting. But because Marian was not a woman you approached carelessly, and what he intended to say deserved to be said properly, not grabbed at in a convenient moment, but made into an actual moment, one that she would know was considered and real. He chose Sunday morning, early, before the rest of the house was properly awake. He'd asked her the night before, casually, as they were finishing up the evening, whether she'd want to ride out to check the eastern boundary with him the next morning. He'd said it was practical. There was a section he wanted an outside eye on, which was true, and she'd said yes without reading anything into it, which was the right response to an honest question. They left before Caleb was up, which was early, and rode east in the pale gold light that happened in Montana in May when the sun was new in the sky and the whole territory looked like it was reconsidering itself. The horses were settled and the air had the clean, specific smell of spring grass and cold water and earth that had come back to life. And neither of them talked much on the way out, which was fine, because they'd developed a working vocabulary of comfortable silences over 4 months. The eastern boundary of Silver Creek ran along a low ridge that gave a view of the valley below and the ranges behind it. And in the morning light, it was the kind of view that made you understand why people had decided this difficult, demanding territory was worth staying in. Ethan pulled up near the fence line, and they sat on their horses for a moment, taking it in. Then he dismounted, and she did too, and he looked at her directly and said, "I didn't actually bring you out here to look at the fence." She looked at him. Something in her face went still in the way it went still when she was paying close attention. "I know," she said. He wasn't surprised she knew. She saw things. He stood there in the morning light on his own land with the valley spread out below them and said what he'd been working toward since a February morning when a 5-year-old had asked him a question that broke something open inside him. He told her that when she'd arrived at his gate, he had already decided to send her away. That he had the words ready and the gate half closed and the decision made. He told her that in 8 years of keeping his life sealed against anything that could cost him the way Sarah's death had cost him, he had become proficient enough at it that he'd stopped noticing what it was taking from him. He told her that the morning he opened that gate, he'd told himself it was practical necessity, and that he'd kept telling himself that through the first week and the second week, and the blizzard, and the rope, and the survey record, and Edwin's visit, and all the weeks after. "I was lying to myself," he said. "I was good at that by then." She was watching him with the steady, direct attention she gave to things that mattered. Somewhere in there, he said, it stopped being about work. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was in the kitchen at 4 in the morning during the storm. Maybe it was the night you came back from the Harris place and I had food on the table because I couldn't do nothing. Maybe it was every evening in that kitchen when I was reading and you were finishing the day and it was quiet, and it was the best quiet I'd had in 8 years. He stopped for a moment. "I love you. I need to say that clearly before anything else. I love you, and I love your children, and I love what this place has become since you came into it, and I am not willing to go back to what it was before." Marian was quiet. He waited because she deserved the space to respond to this in her own time and not in his. "The night of the storm," she said finally. "When I held your hands in the dark and you laughed. That's when I knew." She paused. "Not because of the laughing, because of what was underneath it. You let me see it, even for just a moment, the man underneath all of this." She gestured, not at the land but at him, at the whole careful architecture of distance he'd built. "I've loved you since then. I just didn't know what to do with it." He said, "Marry me." Just that. No elaborate framing. He was not a man who could ornament something like this without making it smaller, and she was not a woman who needed ornamentation. She looked at him, and in her face was the fullness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is finally being offered a place to set it down. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not the urgent grip of someone afraid she'd change her mind, but the steady, deliberate hold of a man committing to something. And they stood on the eastern ridge of Silver Creek Ranch in the May morning, with the valley below them, and 8 years of Ethan's careful solitude dismantled completely. And it was not smooth or cinematic or without the complicated emotional weight of two people who had both lost things they loved and were choosing, with full knowledge of what loss felt like, to love something again. That was the harder kind of love, the kind that isn't innocent, the kind that knows exactly what it's risking and chooses anyway. They rode back to the ranch in a different silence than the one they'd ridden out in. Caleb was in the yard when they returned, working on the wagon harness that had been fraying at one end and needed replacing. He looked up when they came through the gate and read whatever was in their faces, or possibly just in the fact that they were riding close together. And Marian's expression had changed in a way that mothers' expressions change when the thing they'd stopped letting themselves want turns out to be available after all. He looked at Ethan. Ethan gave him a small nod. Caleb looked back down at the harness. "About time," he said, to the harness or to the air or to no one in particular, and kept working. And Ethan thought, without saying it out loud, because some things you keep for yourself, that Thomas Hale had done something right by this boy. Nora's response was delivered at breakfast, with her characteristic economy. She looked at her mother across the table, then at Ethan, then back at her mother. "You're getting married," she said. It was not a question. "We are," Marian said. Nora nodded once as though this confirmed a figure she'd already run in her head. "I updated the accounts last night. There are some entries that will need to be reclassified once the legal arrangement changes." She picked up her fork. "I'll handle it." Ethan looked at her. That's all you're going to say? Nora considered him with her grave, assessing eyes. You took long enough to figure it out, she said. I didn't think commenting on it further would help. He almost laughed. He contained it. Fair enough, he said. Jamie's response was less restrained and more operationally focused. He came downstairs to find the adults at breakfast in a configuration that evidently communicated something to him, because he looked at his mother and then at Ethan, and then said, Are we going to stay? We're going to stay, Marian said. Jamie looked at Pepper, who was on the bench beside him in defiance of several stated policies that had never been meaningfully enforced. Pepper too? Pepper too, Ethan said. Jamie nodded with the deep satisfaction of someone whose primary concern has been addressed. Then he picked up his biscuit and said, I knew you weren't going to make us leave, and ate his breakfast with complete serenity. Later, when Marian asked him how he'd known, he said, Because Pepper decided to live here. Pepper is smart about people. Nobody argued with this. The summer settled into Silver Creek with a heat and light that the ranch hadn't felt, not from the inside, not with this particular quality, in a long time. The cattle thrived on the spring grass. The fence repairs from the winter held. Gerald Harris came twice a week to work on the South Foundation, and the work he did was clean and permanent, and when it was finished, he stood back and looked at it and said simply, That'll hold, which was the highest available assessment from a man who didn't embellish. Clara Harris came with him on the second Saturday of June with a jar of preserved plums, and sat in Marian's kitchen and talked for 3 hours. And when Gerald and Ethan came in from the foundation work, the two women had achieved the kind of friendship that can only happen between people who have been through something difficult in proximity to each other, and come out recognizing something true about who the other person is. The community's shift, which had started in March and continued through spring, completed itself over the summer in the quiet, undramatic way that community shifts do when they are genuine rather than performed. People who had questioned the arrangement stopped questioning it, not because they were asked to, but because the evidence had simply become impossible to align with the original judgment. A widow who managed her own household, contributed to a neighbor's recovery, kept accurate accounts, and earned the respect of the men who worked alongside her was not the problem that had been suggested. She was, it turned out, exactly what she had always claimed to be, a woman who could do the work. Silas Vane came in July. He came alone, which was itself a statement, and he came to the front of the house and knocked, which was a different statement from his previous arrivals. Ethan answered the door and looked at him without expression. I'd like a few minutes, Silas said. All right, Ethan said, and stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him, because this was going to be a porch conversation rather than a kitchen conversation. They stood in the July heat with the valley stretched out below them, and Silas looked older than he had in February. Not diminished exactly, but recalibrated, the way men sometimes get when something they were certain about turns out to be wrong, and they're honest enough to acknowledge it. I wanted to say it directly, Silas said. I was wrong about the situation here, about the woman and her children, and about what it meant for you and for this valley. He paused. I've been hearing things this spring and summer that I should have understood from the start, and I didn't because I was too busy deciding what I thought to pay attention to what was actually happening. Ethan waited. The boundary matter, Silas said. That was an overreach on my part. I had a weakness in my own records, and I was hoping the pressure would settle the question before it came to light. That was wrong, and I know it. There were several things Ethan could have said to this. He said the one that was true. It's settled. I know it is. Silas looked at him. You're getting married. Word travels. It does. He was quiet for a moment. She's a remarkable woman. I understand that now. He said it without qualification, which was the most it could have meant. I thought what I was doing was protecting something. The order of things here, the way the valley worked. He looked out at the ranch. I think I was mostly protecting my own position. Ethan thought about how to respond to a man being honest with himself in front of you, which required a particular kind of handling that wasn't about winning or losing. I appreciate you coming, he said. And then, because it was also true, come to the wedding. Marian would want that. Silas looked at him with something that might have been genuine surprise. She doesn't know you well enough to not want it, Ethan said. And you don't know her well enough yet either. That can be fixed. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I'll come, he said. He did come. On a Saturday morning in late August, with his wife and without his hired men, and he sat in the third row of the small gathering at Silver Creek and watched Ethan Cole and Marian Hale get married in the yard of the ranch, with Gerald and Clara Harris, and Roy and Decker, and a circuit judge who owed Gerald a favor, and the full attendance of the Valley's opinion at its most revised and willing to be wrong. Nora wore her best dress and stood with her ledger under her arm until Marian quietly removed it and handed it to Caleb, who held it for the duration with the expression of someone who had been assigned an important role. Caleb stood straight and serious and had his father's face in the morning light, and he met Ethan's eyes at one point during the ceremony with an expression that settled into something so clear and uncomplicated that Ethan had to look away for a moment. Jamie held Pepper. Nobody told him not to. It had simply stopped being a battle anyone was going to win, and besides, the gray cat sat with his usual equanimity through the entire proceeding, surveying the gathering from Jamie's arms with the air of someone who had been expecting this outcome for some time and was satisfied to see it arrive. The judge said the words. Ethan and Marian said theirs. They were short, as Ethan had requested, because he was not a man made for long public declarations, and Marian understood that, and the brevity of them made them more rather than less, the way understatement sometimes carries more weight than elaboration. Silas Vane shook Ethan's hand afterward with a grip that had in it something he was trying to convey that he didn't have words for, and Ethan took it for what it was, which was a man being better than he'd been before, which is not a small thing. Clara Harris cried, which she would later attribute to the altitude. Gerald Harris ate 4 pieces of the cake that Marian had made herself the previous day and offered no apology. Roy, who was not a demonstrative man, shook Ethan's hand and then shook Marian's hand and said, "Good," which was the full extent of his commentary and precisely enough. Decker, who had grown up substantially in 8 months, made a toast that was slightly too long and slightly too earnest, and entirely from the right place, and everyone let him finish it. In September, Ethan rode into Clearwater on a regular supply run and stopped at the trading post. He went in for flour and salt and 3 items on Nora's supply list that had been revised twice for accuracy. And while he was waiting for the order to be filled, he stood near the community board on the wall where notices were pinned, land sales and livestock auctions and wanted postings, and, faded now, a notice he recognized from its position and its handwriting, his own notice. Still there, barely legible now, pinned at the edge of the board in February and never taken down. Cook wanted. Silver Creek Ranch, room and meals provided. He stood there for a moment looking at it. He thought about the morning he'd written it, sitting alone at his kitchen table with Patterson's empty job in front of him and 8 years of careful solitude behind him, and no expectation that the advertisement would produce anything other than a temporary solution to a practical problem. He thought about a broken wheel and a tired horse, and a woman who looked at him directly when most people didn't. He thought about a 5-year-old with brown eyes who asked him a question he couldn't answer the way he'd planned to. He thought about 4 in the morning in the kitchen and a blizzard against the walls and cold hands held in warm ones, and a laugh that came out of him after 8 years of holding it somewhere he couldn't reach. He thought about Caleb's written fence assessments and Nora's revised supply lists, and Pepper's absolute certainty about where he lived, and Jamie's complete confidence that the world would arrange itself correctly around the things that mattered. He thought about Marian. He reached up and unpinned the notice from the board, folded it once, and put it in his coat pocket. The trading post owner looked at him from across the counter. "Old notice?" he asked. "Mine," Ethan said, "from February." The man nodded with the incurious acceptance of a man who has seen many things come and go on his notice board. "Filled the position?" Ethan thought about the word position, about what he'd been looking for when he wrote that notice, and what he'd found instead. "Something like that," he said. He rode home in the September afternoon with the notice in his pocket and the valley around him doing what Montana valleys do in September, the light angled and golden, the grass gone to amber at the edges, the whole territory in the particular state of transition between what it's been and what it's about to be. There is something that people don't tell you about solitude, and it's this. It doesn't announce itself as loneliness while you're in it. It disguises itself as preference, as discipline, as the reasonable conclusion of a man who has done his calculations and decided that what he has is sufficient. You stop noticing the silence after a while. You stop noticing that the house sounds different when there's only one person in it, that the kitchen table has a particular quality of emptiness when you sit at one end of it alone, that the evenings are a different kind of long when there's no one to sit with at the end of them. You tell yourself you've made peace with it, and you have, after a fashion. But making peace with something is not the same as being content with it. And the difference between those two states is exactly the difference between a life that functions and a life that means something. Ethan Cole had spent 8 years making peace with an empty house and telling himself it was contentment. He hadn't known the difference until a broken-down wagon stopped at his gate on a February morning and a woman with honest eyes looked at him directly, and a 5-year-old asked him a question that went straight to the part of him he'd been most carefully not looking at. The gate had been almost closed. He'd been standing right there with his hand on it, ready to finish what he'd started, to keep the life he'd built sealed against anything that might complicate it or cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. He opened it instead, not because he was a better man than he'd been the moment before, not because he'd made a conscious decision to be braver or more open or any of the things people say when they're describing someone else's transformation from a comfortable distance. He opened it because a small voice asked him a question, and the question found the exact crack in the wall he'd built, and the wall, which had seemed so solid, turned out to have been waiting for exactly that. What came through that gate was not what he'd advertised for. It was better. It was harder and louder and more complicated and more expensive in every sense of the word, and better in every way that mattered. And he understood now, riding home through the September light, that the things worth having almost always arrive in the form of something you weren't expecting and didn't think you needed, and that the only thing standing between a man and the life he actually wants is usually a gate he's holding half closed out of habit and calling it wisdom. He crested the last rise before the ranch, and Silver Creek came into view below him, and the smoke was rising from the chimneys the way it rose now, steady and permanent, and the yard had the full, occupied look of a place where things were happening at all hours. And he could see from here the small figure of Jamie in the yard, crouched over something in the dirt that required his full investigation, with Pepper a gray shape beside him sharing in the inquiry. He could see Caleb near the barn, doing something with the water pump that had frozen last winter and been repaired and was apparently requiring attention again, and working through it with the methodical focus of someone who has learned that the second time through a problem is faster and better than the first. He could not see Nora from here, but he knew she was somewhere in the house with her ledger and her precise handwriting and her 10-year-old certainty that the world could be understood if you organized the information correctly, and he had started to think she might be right about that. And Marian would be in the kitchen or in the garden she'd started behind the house in May, or on the porch with Clara Harris if Clara had ridden over, or somewhere on this ranch doing something useful, which was simply how she existed in a place, not as a presence that decorated it, but as a force that made it function, the way certain people are so naturally and completely themselves that everywhere they are becomes more itself too. He sat on his horse on the rise for a moment and looked at all of it. Then he rode down to the gate and opened it and rode through. He had spent 8 years closing that gate behind him at the end of every day, and the sound of it had been one of the sounds of his life. The particular click of the latch engaging, the small finality of a man securing his boundaries against everything outside them. He didn't close it behind him this time. He rode through and left it open, swinging gently in the September air, the way a gate should be when the people who matter to you are already home and nothing you need to protect yourself from is still out there. Jamie looked up from his investigation in the dirt and said, "You're back," with the complete satisfaction of a 5-year-old for whom the return of people they love is both expected and worth announcing. "I'm back," Ethan said. "Pepper found something," Jamie said, and pointed to whatever was in the dirt. "What is it?" Jamie looked at it with great seriousness. "We're not sure yet. We're still investigating." Ethan swung down from the horse and handed the reins to Caleb, who had appeared from the direction of the barn with the timing of someone who had been watching for him. Caleb took the reins without ceremony and led the horse toward the barn, and Ethan crouched down beside Jamie to look at whatever was in the dirt. It was a beetle. A large, remarkable, entirely ordinary beetle making its way across the yard with the focused determination of a creature that knows exactly where it's going and is not interested in detours. "It's a beetle," Ethan said. "I know," Jamie said. "But where is it going?" Ethan looked at the beetle. It was moving southeast with absolute conviction. "Home, probably," Ethan said. Jamie considered this. "How does it know the way?" Ethan thought about that honestly for a moment, about gates and distances, and the particular way a place becomes home, not through intention, but through the accumulation of moments that you don't always recognize as significant until you look back at them and understand what they were. It just knows, he said. Jamie accepted this and turned back to the beetle with renewed respect, and Pepper leaned forward and sniffed the beetle and then withdrew with the dignified indifference of a cat who has assessed something and found it beneath comment. Ethan stood up. Marian was in the doorway of the house, watching him from across the yard with the expression she had when she was glad about something but wasn't going to make a production of it. He looked back at her, across the yard of his ranch, their ranch, and the September light was on everything and the smoke was coming from the chimneys. And somewhere inside the house, Nora was keeping the accounts accurate, and somewhere in the world, Edwin Hale was going about his life in Ohio, understanding that his brother's family had found something that couldn't be improved upon by relocation. Ethan walked across the yard toward the house, toward her. The man who had spent 8 years convinced that an empty house was the safest possible house, that solitude was wisdom and distance was self-preservation, that the gate closed was better than the gate open. That man had been wrong, and had been given the extraordinary luck of finding out before the cost of being wrong became permanent. Not every man gets that. Some men close the gate and the wagon doesn't stop, and they spend the rest of their lives in their careful, insulated days, never knowing what they kept out, never hearing the question that would have broken something open and let the light in. Some men open the gate, but can't let what comes through it become real, because the memory of what they lost is louder than the reality of what they've found. Some men get almost there, and stop, and call it good enough. Ethan Cole walked through the door of his own home, and it was warm inside, and it smelled like bread and coffee, and the particular smell of a house that is inhabited by people who are genuinely living in it, and Marian looked at him the way she looked at things that mattered to her. Directly, without performance, with the full weight of her attention, and he thought that whatever the opposite of an empty house was, this was it. He had posted a notice for a cook. He had found a family. The gate at Silver Creek Ranch stayed open from that day on, summer and winter, the latch unlatched, the gap a few inches wide. Not an oversight, not a mechanical failure, but a decision. A small, deliberate, daily reminder from a man who had learned the hard way that the things worth protecting are not kept safe by closing yourself against them, but by being willing every morning to choose them again. He chose them every morning. That was enough. That was everything.